The gunshot that killed Marshal Thomas Brooks echoed through Redemption Gulch at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday in April of 1881. And by 6 o'clock that same evening, his daughter Helen Brooks stood in the undertaker's parlor with her father's silver star pinned crooked over her heart, refusing to let anyone in that dusty Wyoming town tell her she could not wear it. The parlor smelled of formaldehyde and lilies, the kind old Mortimer Chase kept in a vase by the door no matter the season, as if flowers alone could cover up the business he conducted in the back room. Helen stood over her father's body, her hands trembling but her jaw set like granite, and when Deputy Cole Ferris tried to reach for the badge she had unpinned from her father's vest and fastened to her own dress, she slapped his hand away with more force than her 22 years and slight frame should have carried. "That is not yours to take, Cole Ferris," she said, her voice cracking but not breaking. "My father wore this star for 11 years. He died wearing it. And I intend to see whoever put a bullet in his chest hang for it, badge or no badge." Cole, a broad-shouldered man of 30 with a mustache he was too proud of, held up both hands. "Helen, I understand your grief, I truly do, but a woman cannot serve as marshal. There has never been such a thing in the whole Wyoming territory, and the town council will never allow it." "Then the town council can come tell me themselves," Helen said, and she turned back to her father's still face, smoothing back the gray hair at his temple with a gentleness that seemed impossible in the same body that had just struck a deputy's hand away. Thomas Brooks had been 58 years old, a widower for the last 9 of those years since Helen's mother had passed from fever, and he had raised his only daughter with a mixture of tenderness and a lawman's discipline that had made her sharper than most men in town and gentler than most women too, a combination that confused the local bachelors and terrified the local troublemakers in equal measure. He had taught her to shoot a Winchester rifle by the time she was 12, to read a man's intentions in his eyes before his hand ever moved toward his holster, and to never, under any circumstances, back down from what was right simply because it was difficult. He had also, apparently, taught her how to grieve with her spine straight and her chin high, because as the small crowd gathered outside the undertaker's window that evening, whispering about the murder and the strange sight of the marshal's daughter wearing his badge, Helen Brooks did not weep where they could see her. She saved that for later, alone in the small house behind the jailhouse where she and her father had lived, when the door was shut and the lamp was low, and there was no one to witness the way her shoulders finally shook. The man who had killed Thomas Brooks was known to the town only as a stranger who had ridden in 3 days prior, dark-coated and quiet, asking after the location of a ranch some 15 miles to the east. Nobody had caught his name. Nobody had thought much of him at all until he had walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon that Tuesday afternoon, exchanged words with the marshal over a debt or an old grievance nobody quite understood, and put 2 bullets into Thomas Brooks before riding out of town at a gallop that raised dust for a full mile behind him. It was Aaron Haskins, a cowhand working the Lazy J Ranch just outside of town, who had been closest to the saloon when the shots rang out, and it was Aaron Haskins who had thrown himself onto his horse and given chase without a single moment's hesitation, though he carried no badge and owed the marshal nothing but the ordinary respect one decent man gives another. He had not caught the killer that day. The stranger's horse had been fresher, or the man had known the country better, or perhaps it was simply bad luck, but Aaron had lost the trail in a wash of rock and scrub some 6 miles out, and he had returned to Redemption Gulch at dusk with his own horse blown and his own temper worse, only to learn that the marshal had died before Aaron had even finished saddling up. He came to the undertaker's parlor not because anyone had summoned him, but because it seemed the only decent thing to do, to pay his respects to a man he had known only casually across a handshake or two at the general store, and to see with his own eyes whether the daughter he had heard so much talk about was faring as poorly as the gossip in town suggested. What he found instead was a young woman standing very straight beside a coffin, wearing a dead man's badge, staring down anyone who dared suggest she remove it. Aaron Haskins was 26 years old, built lean and hard from years of ranch work, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of weathered oak, and he had never in his life seen anything quite like Helen Brooks in that moment. He stood in the doorway of the parlor with his hat in his hands, uncertain whether he was intruding, and it was Helen who noticed him first, her gaze cutting sharp and wary toward the newcomer. "You are the one who chased him," she said. "It was not a question." "I am, ma'am." "I am sorry I could not catch him." Aaron shifted his weight, feeling suddenly too large for the small, flower-scented room. "I am sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man, fair. I never once saw him abuse the authority he carried, and in this territory that is saying something." Helen studied him for a long moment, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, some small fraction of the iron grip she had kept on herself since the moment she had heard the news. "Thank you for trying," she said. "Most men in this town would have let him ride and gone back to their supper." "I am not most men," Aaron said simply, and though he had not meant it as anything more than a plain statement of fact, something passed between them in that lamplit room, some current of understanding that neither of them could yet name, though both would remember the moment for the rest of their lives. The funeral was held 2 days later on a hillside overlooking the town, beneath a cottonwood tree that Thomas Brooks himself had once said he wanted to be buried near, and nearly the whole population of Redemption Gulch turned out, some 300 souls, because a murdered marshal was not a small thing in a territory still finding its legs after the war, and still working out exactly what law meant on the frontier. Reverend Elias Boone spoke words about duty and sacrifice in the Lord's mysterious plan, and Helen stood at the graveside in a black dress that had belonged to her mother, her father's badge still pinned to her breast, and she did not cry until the first shovel of earth struck the coffin, and then she cried silently, tears streaming without a sound, while Aaron Haskins stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her, wanting badly to go to her side though he had no earthly right to do so. It was after the funeral, at the modest gathering held in the church hall, where the women of the town had laid out ham and biscuits and strong coffee, that the town council chose to make their move, and it was there that the true shape of the conflict to come first revealed itself. Mayor Horace Pemberton was a heavy-set man with mutton chops and a fondness for his own voice, and he cornered Helen near the coffee urn with an expression of practiced sympathy that did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I want you to know the council's deepest condolences for your father. He served this town honorably for over a decade." "Thank you, Mayor Pemberton," Helen said, her voice carefully even. "Now, as to the matter of the badge you are wearing," Pemberton continued, and Helen felt her spine stiffen even before he finished the sentence. "The council has met, and we have decided that Deputy Ferris shall assume the duties of marshal until a proper election can be held. It would not be fitting, you understand, for a young woman to carry such responsibility. The dangers are simply too great." "The dangers were too great for my father as well, and he carried them for 11 years, Helen replied. "I have grown up in that jailhouse, Mayor. I know every ledger, every wanted poster, every man in this town who owes money he should not owe, and every man who has threatened violence he never followed through on. I know this territory better than Cole Ferris knows the back of his own hand." "Be that as it may," Pemberton said, his jowls trembling slightly with the effort of maintaining his composure, "the law is the law, and it has never been the practice in this territory, nor in any territory I know of, for a woman to hold the office of town marshal." Helen set down her coffee cup with a precise, deliberate click against the saucer. "Then I suppose, Mayor, that Redemption Gulch shall simply have to become the first." The hall had gone quiet around them, the assembled mourners turning to watch the exchange with the particular hunger small towns reserve for spectacle, and it was into this silence that Aaron Haskins, standing near the door with a plate of untouched food, found himself speaking before he had fully decided to. "Begging your pardon, Mayor," he he said, stepping forward, "but I chased the man who killed the marshal and I lost him. If Miss Brooks knows this territory and these men as well as she says, and I have no reason to doubt her, then perhaps the town could use someone with that knowledge riding beside whoever takes up the star. I would be willing to ride with her myself if the council would allow it until the matter of her father's murder is settled." Pemberton turned his attention to Aaron with visible surprise. "And who might you be, young man?" "Aaron Haskins. I work the Lazy J for Mr. Jennings." "A cowhand proposing himself as a deputy," Pemberton said, not quite scoffing but close to it. "A cowhand who was the only man in this town willing to give chase when the shots were fired," Helen interjected, and there was something new in her voice now, something that had not been there a moment before, a note of alliance where before there had been only grief and defiance. The argument that followed lasted the better part of an hour, drawing in half the council and most of the mourners still present, and it was ultimately resolved not by any grand legal principle, but by simple practicality, the kind that so often governed frontier towns, whether the law books said so or not. Deputy Cole Ferris, it turned out, had no actual desire to become marshal. The responsibility frightened him more than he cared to admit, and the notion of hunting down whoever had killed Thomas Brooks in cold blood, likely a hardened gunman with nothing left to lose, appealed to him not at all. "I will keep my deputy's post," Ferris said finally, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, "but I want no part of chasing that killer across half the territory. Let Miss Brooks wear the badge if she is so determined, and let this cowhand ride with her if he is fool enough to volunteer. It is her father's blood being avenged, after all, not mine." Mayor Pemberton, sensing the tide of the room had turned against him and unwilling to be seen as heartless toward a grieving young woman in front of the entire town, relented with poor grace. "Very well. Miss Brooks may serve as acting marshal until the murder of her father is resolved and an election can be properly held. Mr. Haskins may serve as her deputy for the same period, provided Mr. Jennings can spare him from ranch duties." Old man Jennings, who had employed Aaron for the past 4 years and thought highly enough of him to trust him with the most difficult cattle drives, simply nodded from where he stood near the punch bowl. "The boy has earned the right to make his own choices. I will manage without him a while." And so it was decided, in a church hall still smelling of ham and coffee and grief, that Helen Brooks, 22 years old and barely 2 hours removed from burying her father, would become the acting marshal of Redemption Gulch, and Aaron Haskins, a cowhand with steady hands and a stubborn conscience, would ride at her side as deputy, though neither of them yet understood how deeply that partnership would come to reshape both their lives. The days that followed were a blur of practical necessity for Helen, who found that grief, when there was work enough to smother it, could be held at bay for hours at a time before it crept back in during the quiet moments, usually late at night when the jailhouse was empty, and the only sound was the ticking of her father's old clock on the wall. She and Aaron spent that first week gathering what information they could. The stranger who had killed Thomas Brooks had left behind almost nothing. No name given at the hotel where he had briefly lodged, no clear description beyond dark clothing, and a scar above his left eyebrow that the bartender at the Silver Dollar recalled after some prodding. Helen pored over her father's old case files late into the night, searching for any mention of a man matching that description, any grudge from years past that might explain why a stranger would ride into town and shoot the marshal dead in broad daylight. It was Aaron who found the first real clue, 3 days after the funeral, while questioning the stable hand who had cared for the stranger's horse during his brief stay in town. "He asked me directions to the Circle K ranch," the stable hand said, "a boy of maybe 16 named Petey who worked for tips and free meals. Said he had business with a man named Garrett Vance. I did not think much of it at the time, but now that I think on it, he seemed awful eager for exact directions, like he did not want to get lost or waste any time getting there." Garrett Vance was a name Helen knew well, and not fondly. He owned the Circle K, a sprawling cattle operation to the east, and he had clashed with her father on more than one occasion over disputed water rights and grazing boundaries. The disputes had never turned violent, not that Helen knew of, but there had been bad blood, harsh words exchanged in the jailhouse and in the street, enough that Vance had once been overheard saying Thomas Brooks would regret crossing him. "You think Vance hired that man to kill your father?" Aaron asked as they rode out toward the Circle K that same afternoon, the prairie grass rippling gold and green around them under a sky so blue it seemed to stretch forever. "I think it is worth asking," Helen said. She rode well, Aaron noticed, her back straight in the saddle, her hands sure on the reins, nothing at all like the fragile creature the town gossips seemed to expect a grieving young woman to be. "My father never accused Vance of anything more than being stubborn and greedy about his water rights, but greed and stubbornness have led men to worse things before." The Circle K ranch house was a grand affair by the standards of the territory. 2 stories of milled lumber freighted in at considerable expense, with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the afternoon light like small mirrors. Garrett Vance himself met them on that porch, a tall man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and cold blue eyes, dressed finer than most ranchers Helen had known, in a way that suggested he wanted everyone to remember exactly how much money he had made from the land he claimed. "Marshal Brooks's daughter," Vance said, looking Helen over with an expression that was not quite respectful and not quite dismissive either, some careful middle ground that made her skin prickle with wariness. "And wearing his star too, I see. Bold choice for a young woman." "Mr. Vance," Helen said, refusing to be baited, "we are here about a stranger who came asking after you 3 days ago. A man with a scar above his left eyebrow, dark coat, quiet manner. He is the man who killed my father." Something flickered across Vance's face, there and gone so quickly that Helen almost doubted she had seen it at all, but Aaron, standing just slightly behind and to the side of her, caught it too, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that had not been there a moment before. "I do not know any man matching that description," Vance said, his voice smooth as poured whiskey. "I have many business dealings, Miss Brooks. Men come and go from this ranch on all manner of errands. I could not begin to account for every stranger who might have asked after me in town." "Funny thing," Aaron said, his tone deceptively mild. "The stable boy remembered him quite clearly asking for you by name. Not just the Circle K, but you specifically, Garrett Vance. That suggests a fair amount of prior acquaintance, would you not say?" Vance's cold eyes shifted to Aaron, taking his measure in a way that made clear he did not think much of a mere ranch hand questioning him. "And who exactly are you, boy?" "Deputy Aaron Haskins, sworn in by the town council 4 days ago." Aaron let the words settle, watching the flicker of surprise cross Vance's face. "I would advise you to answer the marshal's questions truthfully, Mr. Vance. Obstruction of a murder investigation is a serious matter, even for a man of your standing." The confrontation might have escalated further had Vance's foreman not appeared at that moment, a burly man named Silas Dunn, who eyed the 2 visitors with open hostility, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip in a manner that Helen recognized as a deliberate warning. "Everything all right here, boss?" Dunn asked. "Everything is fine, Silas," Vance said, though his voice had gained a harder edge. "The marshal's daughter and her hired boy were just leaving. I have told them I know nothing of any stranger, and that is the truth of the matter. I would suggest they look elsewhere for their answers, or they might find that accusations against powerful men in this territory tend to reflect poorly on those making them." It was, Helen recognized, both a denial and a threat wrapped together so smoothly that a less experienced ear might have missed the second part entirely. But she had grown up listening to men lie and posture and threaten in her father's jailhouse, and she knew the sound of it as well as she knew her own name. "We will find our answers, Mr. Vance," she said, turning her horse back toward town, "one way or another." They rode in silence for the first mile back toward Redemption Gulch, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet that neither of them paid much attention to, too caught up in the tension of the encounter they had just left behind. "He is lying," Aaron said finally. "I know he is lying." Helen's hands tightened on the reins. "The question is what we do about it. We have no proof, only a stable boy's memory of a name mentioned in passing. Vance has money and standing in this territory. If we accuse him without solid evidence, we will lose whatever credibility we have and give him time to cover his tracks even further." "So what do we do?" Helen was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle high overhead, riding some current of wind invisible to those below. "We wait, we watch, and we find the man with the scar because he is the one who pulled the trigger, and he is the one who can tell us who paid him to do it." It was a sound plan, born of Helen's years watching her father work through difficult cases. But plans, as both of them would soon learn, had a way of unraveling on the frontier, where violence had a habit of arriving faster than justice. Over the following 2 weeks, Helen and Aaron settled into an uneasy but effective partnership, patrolling the town's dusty streets by day, investigating leads by lamplight in the evenings, and slowly, without either of them quite noticing at first, growing closer in ways that had nothing to do with the murder they were pursuing. It happened in small moments. Aaron noticed the way Helen's face softened when old Mrs. Kirkland brought a plate of cookies to the jailhouse, insisting the marshal's daughter needed proper feeding since she had taken to working through mealtimes. He noticed how Helen, despite the weight of grief still visible in the shadows beneath her eyes, still managed to laugh, a genuine, unguarded sound, when a stray dog wandered into the office and stole a biscuit right off the desk in front of them. Helen, for her part, began to notice things about Aaron too. The careful, deliberate way he cleaned his rifle each evening, as if the ritual itself brought him some measure of peace. The gentleness with which he handled the town drunk, old Silas Whitfield, guiding the man home each night rather than simply locking him in a cell as many lawmen might have done. The quiet respect he showed her at every turn, never once suggesting that her grief made her unfit for the work, never once questioning her judgment simply because she wore a skirt instead of trousers. "You could have gone back to the Lazy J by now," Helen said one evening, nearly 3 weeks after the funeral, as they sat together on the jailhouse porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. "The town council never expected you to stay this long. Mr. Jennings must need you back at the ranch." Aaron considered this for a moment before answering, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Jennings can manage without me a while longer. Besides," he paused, seeming to weigh whether to continue, "I told the mayor I would ride with you until this matter of your father's murder was settled. I meant that. I do not go back on my word." "Is that the only reason you stay?" The question came out before Helen fully intended it, and she immediately felt a flush of embarrassment climb her neck, wondering if she had overstepped some boundary between them. But Aaron did not seem offended. Instead, he looked at her directly, his weathered oak eyes holding hers with a steadiness that made her breath catch slightly in her chest. "No," he said simply, "it is not the only reason." Neither of them said more on the subject that evening, but something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement of feeling that neither was quite ready to name aloud, though both carried the weight of it home with them that night, turning it over in their thoughts long after the lamps had been extinguished. The investigation, meanwhile, had reached a frustrating standstill. No further sign of the scarred stranger had surfaced, and Garrett Vance, though clearly rattled by their visit, had made no move that could be construed as an admission of guilt. Helen began to fear that whoever had orchestrated her father's murder had covered their tracks too well, that justice might slip through her fingers no matter how hard she fought for it. The break came unexpectedly, in the form of a letter delivered to the jailhouse by the weekly stagecoach, addressed simply to the Marshal of Redemption Gulch, in handwriting that was cramped and uneven, as if the writer had composed it in haste or under considerable strain. Helen opened it with careful fingers, and Aaron watched her face change as she read, the color draining slowly from her cheeks. "What is it?" he asked. "It is from a woman in Cheyenne," Helen said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "She says her husband is a man named Judd Calloway, and that he confessed to her, drunk one night, that he had been paid $200 by a rancher to kill a lawman in a town called Redemption Gulch. She says her husband has a scar above his left eyebrow from a knife fight some years back, and that she is writing because her conscience will not let her rest, knowing an innocent man's daughter might never see justice done." "Does she name the rancher?" Helen scanned further down the letter, her finger tracing the cramped script. "She says Judd never spoke the name directly, only that the man was wealthy, owned a great deal of cattle land, and had some old grudge over water rights that had festered for years." She looked up at Aaron, her eyes bright with something between grief and vindication. "It has to be Vance." "It certainly sounds like him," Aaron agreed. "But a letter from a fearful wife, without a name spoken outright, will not be enough to convict a man like Garrett Vance in any court in this territory. We need Judd Calloway himself, and we need him to confess." "Then we go to Cheyenne," Helen said, already rising from her chair with new purpose animating her movements. "Helen." Aaron's voice was gentle but firm, and it was the first time he had used her given name rather than the formal address he had maintained since the day of the funeral. She stilled at the sound of it, something warm unfurling in her chest despite the gravity of the moment. "Cheyenne is nearly 80 miles from here. A hard 2 days' ride, maybe more depending on weather. And if this Calloway is indeed a hired killer, he will not take kindly to being confronted, especially not by the daughter of the man he murdered. I know the risks, Aaron." She met his gaze steadily. "But I did not take up my father's badge to sit safely behind this desk while his killer walks free. I have to see this through. I owe him that much." Aaron studied her for a long moment, and Helen watched something resolve itself behind his eyes, some decision settling into place. "Then we go together," he said. "I will not let you ride into that kind of danger alone, and I do not expect you would listen if I told you to stay behind regardless." Despite the seriousness of the moment, a small smile tugged at the corner of Helen's mouth. "You are learning." "I'm a fast study when properly motivated," Aaron replied, and the answering warmth in his own smile told her that his motivation had very little to do with the murder investigation, and a great deal to do with the woman standing before him. They departed for Cheyenne the following morning before dawn, provisions packed carefully into saddlebags, rifles cleaned and loaded, and a letter carefully folded into Helen's vest pocket alongside her father's badge. The ride was long and largely silent for the first several hours, both of them conserving their energy and their horses' strength for the journey ahead. But as the afternoon sun climbed high and hot overhead, they paused to rest and water the horses at a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, and it was there that the conversation between them deepened into something neither had quite anticipated. "Tell me about your father," Aaron said, settling onto a flat rock near the water's edge while the horses drank their fill nearby. "Not the marshal, the man. What was he like when he was not wearing that badge?" Helen was quiet for a moment, watching the water ripple over smooth stones. "He used to sing," she said finally, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Terribly off-key, mind you, but he sang while he worked, old hymns mostly, and sometimes silly songs he made up himself about whatever chore he was doing at the time. He taught me to read using the Bible and old newspapers, because those were the only books we had, and every Sunday, no matter how tired he was from the week, he would take me fishing at this very creek actually, if you can believe that. This was one of his favorite spots. He sounds like he loved you very much." "He did." Helen's voice caught slightly. "He was not always an easy man. He held himself and everyone around him to a hard standard of right and wrong, and sometimes that made him difficult to live with, especially after my mother died and it was just the two of us. But I never once doubted that he loved me, or that he would have done anything, anything at all to see me safe and happy in this world." "That is more than many people can say of their fathers," Aaron said quietly, and something in his tone made Helen look at him more closely. "What about your own father?" she asked. Aaron's expression shuddered slightly, a wall coming down that Helen recognized because she had built similar walls herself over the years. "Father was not a kind man," he said after a long pause. "He drank too much and had a temper to match the whiskey. My mother passed when I was young, and I left home at 15 rather than stay under his roof another year. I have not spoken to him since, and I do not imagine I ever will again." "I am sorry," Helen said softly, and she reached out without quite thinking about it, laying her hand over his where it rested on the rock between them. "That must have been a lonely way to grow up." Aaron did not pull his hand away. Instead, he turned it slightly beneath hers so that their palms pressed together, warm and steady. "It was for a time. But I found my own way, working ranches across 3 territories, learning the trade, saving what money I could. And I found decent people along the way too, men like Jennings who treated me fairly, who taught me that not every older man had to be like my father." He looked up at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "And now I have found you, Helen Brooks, and whatever loneliness I carried before seems a good deal lighter for it." The words hung between them in the warm afternoon air, and Helen felt her heart quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear or grief, and everything to do with the man sitting beside her, his hand warm and sure around hers. "Aaron," she started, uncertain exactly what she meant to say next, but he seemed to understand the uncertainty in her voice, and he did not push further, simply gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "We should keep moving," he said, though his voice was rougher than before. "We want to reach Cheyenne before nightfall tomorrow if we can manage it." They remounted and continued their journey, but something had changed between them at that creek, some barrier lowered that would not be raised again, and though they spoke little of it in the hours that followed, both carried the warmth of that moment with them like a small, steady flame against the vast loneliness of the open prairie. They reached Cheyenne on the evening of the second day, weary from the ride but alert with the tension of what lay ahead. Cheyenne was a proper city by territorial standards, with the Union Pacific Railroad running straight through its heart, gas lamps lining the main thoroughfare, and buildings of brick and stone that made Redemption Gulch look like the small frontier outpost it truly was. Finding Judd Calloway proved easier than either of them had anticipated. The letter's return address led them to a modest house on the outskirts of town, and it was there that they found not Calloway himself, but his wife, a thin, careworn woman named Sarah, who answered the door with visible apprehension when Helen explained who they were and why they had come. "He is not here," Sarah said, glancing anxiously over her shoulder as if fearing her husband might appear at any moment. "He left 3 days ago, said he had business to attend to, would not say where. I have been sick with worry ever since I sent that letter, wondering if I did the right thing, wondering if he would find out and what he might do if he did." "You did the right thing," Helen assured her, stepping inside at the woman's hesitant invitation. "My father deserves justice, and you have given us the means to find it. But we need to know where Judd might have gone. Did he say anything at all before he left, anything that might give us a clue?" Sarah wrung her hands, clearly torn between fear for her husband and whatever remained of her conscience. "He said something about needing to see Vance again, about needing more money before he would agree to keep quiet about what happened. He seemed frightened, more frightened than I had ever seen him, like he knew things were closing in around him." Aaron and Helen exchanged a look. If Calloway had gone to see Vance again, that meant he was likely headed back toward Redemption Gulch, or perhaps to some meeting point between the 2 towns. "Is there anywhere specific he might go to meet Vance?" Aaron asked. "Some place they have used before, away from prying eyes." Sarah thought for a long moment before her face cleared with sudden recollection. "There is an old line shack, out past the fork where the road splits toward the Circle K. Judd mentioned it once, said it was where he had first met with Vance to discuss the job. Abandoned place. Nobody uses it anymore except for men wanting to conduct business they would rather keep private. It was enough to go on. Helen thanked Sarah for her help, offering what reassurance she could that no harm would come to the woman for her honesty. And then she and Aaron were back on their horses, riding hard through the gathering dusk, retracing their path but veering now toward the fork in the road that Sarah had described, praying they would arrive in time to catch both men together, to finally bring an end to the search that had consumed the past month of their lives. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses, and reached the area of the fork just as gray dawn light began to spread across the eastern sky. The old line shack, when they finally spotted it nestled in a shallow draw surrounded by scrub brush, showed signs of recent occupation. A thin trail of smoke rising from a makeshift chimney, 2 horses tethered nearby, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Helen and Aaron dismounted a quarter-mile out, approaching the rest of the way on foot, moving carefully through the brush to avoid detection. As they drew closer, voices became audible from within the shack, raised in what sounded like an escalating argument. "You said this would be the end of it." A man's voice, rough and edged with desperation, carried through the thin walls. "You said once the marshal was dead, that would settle things, and I would get my money and be done with this whole business. Now you are asking me to disappear entirely, leave the territory, and for what? Because some fool woman is asking questions." "That fool woman is the dead marshal's daughter," came Vance's cold, controlled voice in response, "and she has taken up his badge and his crusade both. If she finds you, Calloway, you will hang, and you will take me down with you if you are not careful. I am offering you money enough to disappear and start fresh somewhere far from this territory. That is more generosity than most men would show." "I want more," Calloway said. "I want enough to actually disappear, not just enough to get by for a few months before I am forced to find work again and risk someone recognizing me." Helen had heard enough. She stepped forward from the brush, her rifle raised, Aaron moving in perfect coordination beside her, his own weapon trained on the shack's single door. "Judd Calloway, Garrett Vance, this is Marshal Helen Brooks. Come out with your hands raised and you will not be harmed." There was a moment of stunned silence from within the shack, followed by a scramble of movement and a low curse from Vance. The door burst open and Calloway emerged first, a thin, wiry man with the promised scar above his left eyebrow, his eyes wild with panic as he took in the sight of the leveled rifles pointed his way. "Do not shoot," he said immediately, his hands shooting up. "I did not want any part of this. Vance paid me, I needed the money, I have a wife and I could not find honest work anywhere in this territory. I did not know he was going to have me kill the marshal specifically. I swear it. He just said there was a lawman causing him trouble and offered good money to handle it." "That is a fine story to tell now that you are caught," Helen said, her voice hard as flint despite the tremor of adrenaline running through her. "But you pulled the trigger, Calloway. You put 2 bullets into my father's chest. No amount of talk about needing money will erase that." Behind Calloway, Vance emerged more slowly, his hands raised but his expression still carrying that same cold arrogance that had marked their first meeting at the Circle K. "This is quite a production, Miss Brooks," he said. "Riding all this way, in the company of your hired cowhand deputy, to make wild accusations you cannot possibly prove." "We do not need to prove anything ourselves, Vance," Aaron said, stepping forward with his rifle steady. "Calloway just confessed to the whole territory that you hired him to kill Marshal Brooks. There were witnesses enough in that shack, and there will be plenty more once he tells the same story before a judge." Vance's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a flash of genuine fear crossing his features before he mastered it once more. "You have no proof of anything," he insisted. "A confession under duress, extracted at gunpoint, will not hold up in any court." "We will let the judge decide that," Helen said, moving forward to secure Calloway's hands with rope she had brought for exactly this purpose. "Aaron, keep an eye on Vance. I do not trust that he will come along peacefully." Her instincts proved correct. As Aaron moved to secure Vance's hands as well, the rancher made a sudden, desperate lunge toward a pistol tucked at his own hip, one he had apparently kept concealed beneath his coat despite his raised hands. Aaron reacted instantly, tackling the older man to the ground before he could draw the weapon, the two of them grappling in the dust while Helen, still holding Calloway's rope, could only watch in horror, unable to intervene without releasing her prisoner. The struggle was brief but violent. Vance, despite his age, fought with the desperate strength of a man who knew he faced the gallows if captured, and for one heart-stopping moment, Helen saw the glint of the pistol in his hand, saw Aaron's arm locked around Vance's wrist trying to keep the weapon pointed away from both of them. Then a shot rang out, muffled and close, and both men went still. "Aaron!" Helen's voice tore from her throat, raw with fear, and for one terrible moment she thought the worst, thought she had lost him just as she had lost her father, before Aaron rolled away from Vance's now limp form and rose unsteadily to his feet, breathing hard but very much alive. "I am all right," he said quickly, seeing the terror on her face. "I am not hit. The shot went into him, not me, in the struggle." Vance lay in the dust, a dark stain spreading across his own coat where the pistol had discharged into his side during the struggle, his breathing shallow and labored. He would live, they would later learn, though the wound was severe enough that he would spend weeks recovering under guard before he could stand trial. But in that moment, all Helen could feel was overwhelming relief that Aaron stood before her, whole and breathing, his weathered oak eyes meeting hers with an intensity that spoke of how close they had both come to losing something precious that morning. "I thought," Helen started, her voice breaking, "I thought for a moment that I had lost you too." Aaron closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, and before either of them fully registered what was happening, his arms were around her, holding her close against his chest, and she was clutching at the front of his shirt as if to reassure herself that he was truly there, truly solid and alive beneath her hands. "I am not going anywhere, Helen," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "Not while there is breath left in me." They stood like that for a long moment, ignoring the groaning form of Garrett Vance and the frightened, bound figure of Judd Calloway nearby, simply holding each other in the gray morning light. The danger past, but something new and vital taking root between them in its aftermath. The journey back to Redemption Gulch was considerably more complicated than the journey out, given that they now had 2 prisoners to transport, one of them wounded and requiring careful handling to prevent his injury from worsening. They managed to flag down a passing freight wagon heading toward Cheyenne, and after explaining the situation to the somewhat bewildered driver, arranged for Vance to be taken to the doctor in Cheyenne under armed guard, with instructions that he be transported back to Redemption Gulch for trial once he was stable enough to travel. Calloway, meanwhile, rode bound behind Helen's horse, his earlier bravado entirely deflated, replaced now by a resigned despair as the reality of his situation settled over him. "I truly did not know he meant to have me kill a marshal specifically," Calloway said at one point during the long ride back, his voice small. "I know that does not excuse what I did. I know I will hang for it regardless. But I want you to know I have thought of nothing else since that day. The way he looked at me right before I pulled the trigger, like he could not quite believe what was happening. I will carry that look with me until the day they hang me, and I expect beyond that too, into whatever comes after." Helen said nothing in response, unwilling to offer this man any comfort or absolution, but something in his confession settled a small, aching part of her grief nonetheless. Some confirmation that her father had not gone easily or without a fight, that he had faced his end with the same courage he had shown throughout his life. They arrived back in Redemption Gulch 3 days later, weary and travel-worn but triumphant, and the news of Vance's arrest and Calloway's confession spread through the small town like wildfire. Mayor Pemberton, who had been so reluctant to grant Helen the marshal's badge in the first place, now found himself in the awkward position of praising her investigative skill to anyone who would listen, eager to align himself with the success rather than be seen as having obstructed it. "A remarkable achievement, Miss Brooks," he said when she delivered her prisoner to the town's small jail, Calloway destined to await trial in the very cell block where Helen's father had once kept the town's lawbreakers. "The council will need to discuss the matter of your continued service as marshal, of course, but I think it is safe to say that your work these past weeks has earned you considerable respect in this community." "Thank you, Mayor," Helen said, too exhausted from the journey to muster much enthusiasm for his sudden change of heart. "Right now, I would simply like to rest, if the council can spare me that courtesy." The trial, when it finally came some 6 weeks later, once Vance had recovered sufficiently to travel and stand before a judge, was swift and decisive. Calloway's confession, corroborated by his wife's testimony and by physical evidence connecting him to the murder weapon, left little room for doubt, and he was sentenced to hang for the murder of Marshal Thomas Brooks. Vance, though he protested his innocence to the end, was convicted as an accomplice and conspirator in the murder, sentenced to a lengthy term in the territorial prison, his cattle empire seized and sold to cover the costs of the trial, and to provide some measure of restitution to the town he had wronged. Justice, such as it could be found in that rough frontier territory, had finally been served. But it was in the months following the trial that the true heart of this story unfolded, not in courtrooms or confrontations, but in the quiet, growing intimacy between Helen Brooks and Aaron Haskins, two people who had been thrown together by tragedy and violence, but who found, in each other's company, something far gentler and more lasting than either had expected to discover on the harsh frontier. With the murder case resolved, the town council held the promised election for a permanent marshal, and though there was considerable debate about whether Helen should be allowed to run given her sex, the events of the preceding months had shifted public opinion considerably in her favor. Many in town had come to respect her competence and dedication, had seen with their own eyes that she was every bit as capable as any man who might have taken up the position. And when the votes were finally counted, Helen Brooks became not merely the acting marshal, but the duly elected marshal of Redemption Gulch, the first woman to hold such a position in the entire Wyoming territory, a fact that would eventually earn mention in newspapers as far away as Denver and Cheyenne. Aaron, for his part, chose to remain as her deputy rather than return to ranch work, a decision that surprised no one who had watched the two of them together over the preceding months, though it took considerably longer for either of them to acknowledge openly what had grown between them. It was a warm evening in late summer, some 4 months after Thomas Brooks had been laid to rest, when matters finally came to a head. Helen and Aaron had spent the day dealing with a minor dispute between two ranchers over a stray bull that had wandered onto the wrong property, a task far removed from the drama of murder and conspiracy that had marked their first weeks together, but satisfying in its own quiet way, the ordinary work of keeping peace in a small frontier town. They sat together on the jailhouse porch as the sun set, sharing a simple supper of bread and cheese that Mrs. Kirkland had brought by earlier that day, the badge on Helen's chest catching the last golden light of the evening. "I have been thinking," Aaron said, setting aside his plate with an air of deliberate purpose that immediately caught Helen's attention. "About what?" "About us." He turned to face her fully, and Helen felt her heart begin to race at the seriousness in his expression. "Helen, these past months, riding beside you, working with you, coming to know you as more than just the marshal's daughter but as the remarkable woman you are in your own right, they have been the finest months of my life, even with all the danger and grief that came alongside them. I do not want to go on pretending that what I feel for you is simply the loyalty of a deputy for his marshal or the respect of a partner for a job well done." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "Aaron, what are you saying?" I am saying that I love you, Helen Brooks." The words came out steady despite the vulnerability visible in his eyes, the risk he was taking in speaking them aloud. "I have loved you since that evening in the undertaker's parlor when you slapped Cole Ferris's hand away, and told the whole world you would not be told what you could and could not wear over your own heart. I have loved you through every mile of this territory we have ridden together, through every danger we have faced side by side, and I find that I do not want to spend another day without telling you so, whatever you might say in return." Tears filled Helen's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than grief, and she reached for his hand, holding it tightly in both of hers. "I love you too, Aaron Haskins. I have for some time now, though I think I was afraid to admit it, afraid that loving you might somehow dishonor my father's memory, as if grief and love could not exist together in the same heart." "Your father's memory could never be dishonored by love," Aaron said gently, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I think, from everything you have told me about him, he would want nothing more than for his daughter to find happiness, even in the midst of everything else you have carried these past months." "I think you are right," Helen said, leaning into his touch. "He always said love was the one thing worth more than gold or land or any earthly treasure a person might chase after. He would have liked you, Aaron. I know he would have. I hope I could have made him proud in some small way, standing beside his daughter as she carried on his work." "You have made him proud," Helen said with certainty. "I know it in my heart." Aaron leaned forward then slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, but she did not pull away. Instead, she closed the remaining distance herself, and their lips met in a kiss that held within it all the grief and joy and hard-won hope of the months they had shared together, a promise of the future neither of them had dared imagine when they had first stood together in that flower-scented parlor, mourning a man whose death had somehow, impossibly, led them both to this moment. They broke apart after a long moment, both slightly breathless, and Aaron rested his forehead against hers, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with a tenderness that made Helen's heart ache with happiness. "I want to marry you, Helen Brooks," he said softly. "Not tomorrow, not necessarily even soon if you feel it is too fast, but eventually, whenever you feel ready. I want to build a life with you, here in this town your father loved, protecting the people he spent his life protecting. I want to grow old beside you, and I want, if you will have me, to be the father of whatever children we might be blessed with, and to raise them with the same courage and integrity you carry in your own heart." "Yes," Helen said, laughing through fresh tears, this time tears of pure joy. "Yes, Aaron, I will marry you. Though I think we should perhaps wait a proper interval, given that I am still the town marshal and you my deputy, and I suspect Mayor Pemberton would have quite a bit to say about impropriety if we rushed things too quickly." Aaron laughed then too, a warm, rich sound that Helen had come to treasure over their months together. "Let the mayor say what he likes. I have learned this past year that some things are worth standing firm on, no matter what the town council might prefer." They were married the following spring, in the same church where Thomas Brooks's funeral had been held nearly a year before, though the atmosphere on that joyful day could not have been more different from the somber grief of the previous spring. Nearly the entire town turned out once again, but this time to celebrate rather than to mourn, and Reverend Boone, who had spoken so solemnly over Thomas Brooks's grave, now spoke with genuine warmth about love overcoming even the darkest tragedy, about how sometimes the Lord's mysterious plan led through valleys of shadow toward unexpected joy on the other side. Helen wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her, and pinned to the bodice, alongside a small cluster of wildflowers, was her father's silver star, which she had continued to wear as marshal throughout the preceding year, but which she chose, on this particular day, to wear not as a symbol of law and duty, but as a symbol of the father who had raised her to be exactly the woman capable of finding love even in the wreckage of tragedy. Aaron, waiting at the altar in a new suit purchased specially for the occasion, could not take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle, and when she reached his side, he leaned close to whisper, just for her ears, "Your father would be so proud of you today, Helen. I only wish he could be here to see it." "He is here," Helen whispered back, her hand finding his and squeezing tightly. "I feel him here with us, Aaron. I truly do." The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt, and when Reverend Boone finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in cheers and applause that would have seemed entirely inappropriate for a somber occasion, but felt exactly right for the joyful celebration this marriage represented. A community coming together to honor not just a union between two people, but the triumph of love and justice over the violence and grief that had once threatened to overwhelm their small frontier town. They settled into married life in the small house behind the jailhouse, the same house where Helen had grown up with her father, though they made some improvements over the following months, adding a proper bedroom addition and repainting the whole structure a cheerful blue that Helen had always admired on similar houses in Cheyenne. Aaron continued his work as deputy, and Helen continued as marshal, the two of them working together with an efficiency and understanding that made Redemption Gulch, over time, one of the safest and most orderly towns in the entire territory, a fact that brought them both considerable pride even as it brought increasing respect from neighboring communities who had once scoffed at the notion of a woman wearing a lawman's star. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Helen's father, was born the following winter, arriving during a snowstorm so severe that Dr. Wilkins nearly could not reach the house in time, delivered instead with the assistance of Mrs. Kirkland, who had raised 7 children of her own and proved more than capable of guiding Helen through the difficult hours of labor, while Aaron paced anxiously in the front room, praying more fervently than he had ever prayed in his life for the safety of his wife and their unborn child. When it was finally over and Aaron was allowed into the bedroom to see his son for the first time, he found Helen exhausted but radiant, the tiny bundle cradled against her chest, and he knelt beside the bed, overwhelmed with an emotion so powerful it left him momentarily speechless. "He has your eyes," Helen said softly, looking down at the infant's face, already showing the promise of the same warm brown that characterized his father's gaze. "And your stubbornness, I suspect, given how long he took his time arriving," Aaron replied, earning a tired but genuine laugh from his wife. Little Thomas Haskins grew into a sturdy, curious boy, and 2 years after his birth, he was joined by a sister, Margaret, named for Helen's mother, and the family that had once seemed impossible during those dark days of grief and pursuit now flourished in the small blue house behind the jailhouse, filled with laughter and the ordinary chaos of small children growing up in a frontier town. Helen continued to serve as marshal for many years, eventually stepping back from the most dangerous aspects of the work as her family grew, though she never fully relinquished her father's badge, passing it eventually not to a stranger or successor, but placing it carefully in a cedar box alongside her mother's wedding dress. Treasures to be passed down to whichever of her children showed the same sense of justice and courage that had defined both their grandfather and their mother. Aaron eventually took over the primary duties of marshal himself, though he always insisted, whenever anyone asked, that Helen remained the true lawkeeper of Redemption Gulch, that his own service was simply an extension of the respect and partnership they had built together during those first crucial months following Thomas Brooks's murder. Garrett Vance served 15 years in the territorial prison before dying there of natural causes, never having expressed any genuine remorse for his role in the murder, while Judd Calloway was hanged that same autumn, 6 weeks after his confession, his final words reportedly an apology to Helen and to the memory of the man he had killed, though whether the apology carried any true sincerity, no one could say with certainty. The town of Redemption Gulch continued to grow over the following decades, eventually incorporating fully as Wyoming moved toward statehood in 1890, and Helen Brooks Haskins, as she came to be known, remained something of a local legend throughout that growth. The woman who had worn her father's badge before the funeral was even over, who had refused to be told she could not seek justice simply because of her sex, and who had found, in the pursuit of that justice, a love that would sustain her for the rest of her days. On quiet evenings, decades later, when their children had grown and moved on to their own lives across the territory, Helen and Aaron would sometimes sit together on that same jailhouse porch where he had first confessed his love, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and violet. And Helen would sometimes take out her father's badge, now more sentiment than symbol of active duty, and turn it over in her hands, remembering the weight of grief and determination that had first led her to pin it to her own chest. "Do you ever wonder," she asked Aaron once, many years into their marriage, both of them now silver-haired and comfortable in the easy intimacy of long partnership, "what my father would think, seeing how everything turned out, seeing the family we built, the life we made together?" Aaron considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything in his life, then reached over to take her weathered hand in his own. "I think," he said slowly, "that he would be proud beyond words. Not just of the justice you sought and found for him, though that alone would mean everything to a man like Thomas Brooks, but proud of the woman you became in the seeking of it. Proud of the mother you have been to our children. Proud of the marriage we built together, founded on respect and partnership rather than simple convenience or arrangement, the way so many marriages in this territory are built. I think he would look at all of it, Helen, and know that his daughter had honored his memory in every way a father could hope for." Helen smiled, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder as the sun continued its slow descent toward the mountains, the same mountains that had witnessed her father's burial so many years before, that had witnessed her own wedding, that had witnessed the birth of her children and the steady, unhurried growth of a love that had begun in tragedy but flourished into something as solid and enduring as the land itself. "I believe you are right," she said softly. "I believe he would be proud of us both." They sat together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, two people who had faced down violence and grief and injustice together, who had found in each other a partnership that made both of them stronger, and who had built, from the ashes of tragedy, a life filled with love, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of justice finally served. The badge that Helen Brooks had claimed before her father's funeral was even had come to represent, over the years, not merely law and duty, but the beginning of a love story that had transformed a grieving daughter and a determined cowhand into partners in every sense of the word, their union standing as testament to the idea that even in the harshest corners of the frontier, even amid violence and loss, love could take root and flourish. Offered the same fierce dedication and unwavering commitment that had first brought them together on that terrible, transformative day in April of 1881. And so it was, on that quiet porch, in the gathering dusk of a life well and fully lived, that Helen Brooks Haskins and Aaron Haskins found themselves exactly where they had always been meant to be. Together, content and deeply, abidingly in love, their story a testament to justice found and love discovered in equal measure, a legacy that would live on not just in the memories of the town they had served, but in the children and grandchildren who would carry forward the values of courage, integrity, and devotion that had defined both their individual lives and the remarkable partnership they had built together against all the odds the frontier had first seemed determined to stack against them.